Hey everyone, my name is Corey Edington. Today we're going to be going through some squats and comparing a front squat to a back squat, as well as building on the first deadlift video. We're going to kind of compare and show you why a squat movement pattern is different from a deadlift. So I have my volunteer Caleb here with me, so he's going to run through some of these exercises as I demonstrate them, so you get a really good visual representation of the two exercises. So we're going to start off with the back squat, talk about some teaching points for that. So I'll get Caleb to put the heavy bar on his shoulders there. So kind of running through everything from the bottom up when we're going through our squats. So foot placement, when we do our squat, we want our feet about shoulder width apart. Now you can play around with this a little bit depending on people's hip structure. Some people will be fine squatting with toes straight forward and feet shoulder width apart. Other people will prefer feet a little bit wider and toes slightly turned out. Either variation is fine. The only thing you want to watch for is just to make sure we still maintain a proper knee tracking pattern. So what I mean by that is if someone's stance is a little bit wider with toes pointed out, just make sure they're not squatting with collapsed knees, but their knees are still slightly pressed outwards in line with that middle toe to smaller toe, so not collapsing in towards your big toe. So once we have a good comfortable foot placement, going from there, again, bar is going to be resting on your shoulders. One thing kind of commonly done wrong is make sure you don't get the bar too high up on your neck. A lot of people get it too high and then it's kind of pressing in to your cervical spine there. So you want to get a little bit lower so it's more so resting on the traps. Okay, so now Caleb's in a pretty good ready position, instructing the person when they're doing a squat. Now again, the squat is kind of, it's a hip hinge as well as a movement through our knees. That's a little bit different from a deadlift, where a deadlift is primarily a hip hinge with a little bit less knee movement there. So I'm going to instruct Caleb to push his hips back behind him while also letting his knees slide forward, and he's going to get his bum behind him just like he's sitting down into a chair, down and back up. So there's a good squat. Again, you'll notice his good knee tracking pattern. His knees are collapsing in. And then another thing to touch on is, you can just stand up there, when our knees come forward, we don't want our knees to shoot past our toes right away, but if we're actually doing a squat to full depth, our knees are going to have to come past our toes eventually. So you'll see Caleb has good mobility, good range of motion there, so he's able to get into a really deep position. You'll see his knees are actually just barely in front of his toes, but again, you never want to cue somebody to immediately push their knees forward, because you'll get people squatting with pretty bad mechanics. But if you want to actually be able to do a proper squat with full depth, your knees are going to have to track just barely in front of your toes eventually. So that's one little thing to keep in mind. Caleb's mechanics were really good there. And one little thing I'll touch on, because there's some confusion about, people don't really know how does a squat pattern differ from a deadlift pattern, and what am I trying to do. Whenever we're doing a deadlift or a squat exercise, the main thing we want to keep in mind is we got this heavy load placed upon our body, and we always want to keep that weight right over top of our center of mass, because whenever it gets outside of that center of mass, it's going to create a rotational moment, and that's going to be more difficult for us to control, and it's going to make our muscles work harder just to maintain good posture instead of being able to use all that muscle force to move the weight. So when Caleb does a squat, I'll get you to just rotate sideways. Kind of a good visual point to think of where their center of mass is. Again, it's going to be right about in the middle of the foot. So whenever Caleb does a squat, the idea is to keep the bar or the load in a direct vertical line with the middle of his foot. So you can see when he's down right there, it's right in line with the middle of his foot. Now if Caleb did a squat with the same pattern that he does a deadlift with, so he pushes his hips back and doesn't get a little knee movement till late, you can see that when he gets into that position, just go down, not quite that deep, but pause. So that'd be a really good deadlift motion if he was doing a deadlift, but you can see that weight is getting way out in front of our center of mass. Okay, now it's trying to pull him over on his face. His hamstrings, glutes, this entire posterior chain is going to have to work a lot harder just to hold him up instead of moving the weight. But When Caleb gets bum back and knees forward, like a good squat, now that bar stays over the center of the foot, okay, and it's not a problem. It's not a problem. Same thing, let's go back to our deadlift. We'll just touch on a deadlift now, so you can see now, we're going to get Caleb to do a deadlift, like he's doing a squat, so pretend you're doing a squat where you keep your torso, you can drop your bum back a little bit. But you see how when he does the deadlift like a squat, again, that bar starts to get out in front of his foot. Same thing, that bar is getting out away from your center of mass. Now your muscles are having to work really hard just to control your body and prevent that rotation. So that's the main way, or why it's important to recognize that a squat pattern is distinct and different from a deadlift pattern. So now that we've touched on back squats, we're also going to touch on front squats here. So front squat, now our bar's going to be placed in front of our body. We can use kind of our standard grip here if you have good shoulder mobility, good wrist mobility, okay. This is a good grip to use when we're doing our front squats. Again, biggest thing here is bar is resting on your delts, okay. Bar is resting on your delts. Make sure those elbows are up, because if they drop, it's going to start to rest on your collarbone, on your clavicle, and it's going to be pretty painful when you're trying to do your front squats. Okay, so make sure those elbows are up. Other grip variation, if we have poor mobility through our shoulders, through our wrists, we can use this modified grip where, again, elbows have to stay up so that bar is resting on our delts, but now our hands are crossed in front of us instead of wrapping around the bar. Okay, so now that we're set up, you can set up in your position there. Again, once we're in this position, the mechanics are essentially the exact same as a back squat, only now we're really going to be challenged to maintain an upright torso or more of an upright position through our chest, because if we collapse forward, that bar is going to fall off our body. So Caleb's going to demonstrate a front squat here. So again, everything is really good with those front squats. Mechanics through the knees, hips, ankles, feet, everything is the same. One thing I didn't really touch on, but again, where should our weight be in our foot when we're doing these squats? We want to make sure our weight is center to back of our foot. Okay, what we really want to watch for is people that get all their weight into their toes. Okay, it gets us a lot of activation through our quads, less activation through our posterior chain, and kind of the main negative thing that comes off of that is you'll see people that get into their toes, right away their knees want to collapse inward because they can't use those, they can't use those posterior muscles to keep their knees pointed out when they're doing those squats. And then a couple other things about the front squat, or why you would maybe choose one or the other. The front squat is a very challenging exercise, and people need good thoracic mobility, so you need good mobility through your thoracic spine, through your hips, through the entire system in order to be able to do a really good front squat. So if you're taking somebody that's been doing back squats their entire life and you want to have them do a front squat, because again, some reasons why you would choose it in the first place, a lot more challenging for the core, so you're going to develop more core strength when you're doing a front squat. You get more work through your upper erector spinae muscles, so really working those muscles that help pull you into a good postural position. But again, if you're progressing to a front squat with someone that's always done a back squat, might be a good idea to work on some mobility exercises first and make sure they have good range of motion through the hips, through the upper back, that kind of stuff, so they're actually going to be able to do a proper front squat, or else they're really going to be challenged when they're doing that exercise, okay? And yeah, those are the main things about front squat and a back squat.